So, if you look at the numbers for 2025, the United States bought nearly $10 billion worth of generic medicine from India.
Yeah, which is just a staggering amount.
Right, 10 billion. We are talking about almost 20% of the entire U.S. generic drug supply right
It's
there.
a massive pipeline. And,
Yeah.
the American healthcare system is arguably bursting at the seams financially right now.
Exactly. It's completely reliant on this flow of incredibly cheap, highly effective Indian pharmaceuticals just to, well, keep the lights on and keep patients treated.
Absolutely.
But then, at the exact same time, you have the United States government officially labeling India as one of the worst threats to global intellectual property in the world.
Yeah, it's quite the paradox.
It really is. I mean, they put them on a priority watch list, they threaten sanctions, they publish these really scathing trade reports. So, welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
Today, we are unpacking this wild geopolitical and economic paradox. You are joining us as we navigate a really massive stack of sources.
We've got the legal analyses from the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, or ICRIER.
Right. Plus the 2026 USTR Special 301 report, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce International IP Index, and some very recent trade policy updates.
And our mission here is to look at the incredibly specific, often really controversial legal standards India uses to either grant or deny pharmaceutical patents.
And obviously, the multi-billion-dollar collision this causes with Western pharmaceutical giants.
Right. And I want to say right up front, the friction here is palpable in every single document we reviewed. We're going to look at this totally neutrally.
Yeah, because there are very strong feelings on both sides.
Exactly. When you read the USTR report, you really feel the frustration of the American pharmaceutical industry. They view India's legal framework as this systemic dismantling of intellectual property rights.
Right, but then you read the legal rulings from the Indian Supreme Court, and it's a completely different philosophy.
A completely different worldview. You see a nation that views pharmaceutical patents not just as, commercial rights, but as literal potential barriers to human survival.
So the goal isn't to pick a winner between Western pharma and Indian regulators. We just want to decode the specific laws, like Section 3rd, and see why they matter to global healthcare.
Exactly. And to really grasp on the mechanics of this friction today in 2026, we actually have to look backward.
Right, chronologically.
Yeah. We can't understand why India's laws are so, well, uniquely hostile to Western patent norms without understanding the colonial legal structure they inherited.
Okay, so let's set the pre-1970 landscape. India gains independence in 1947, right?
Right. And they inherit the British Patents and Designs Act of 1911.
And from everything in the ICRIER report, this law was basically a mercantilist weapon.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't designed to foster innovation in India at all.
It was just to guarantee that British and other Western manufacturers had this captive market of, 400 million people?
Yeah, the 1911 Act was a classic colonial extraction mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
It allowed foreign pharma companies to hold absolute monopolies over products in India.
Without having to actually make the drugs there.
Exactly. Zero obligation to manufacture those products within Indian borders. They could source cheap raw materials from the colonies, make the complex medicines in Europe or the U.S., and export them back.
At massive premium prices, I imagine.
Premium prices, yes. So the new Indian government is facing these massive public health crises, tuberculosis, malnutrition-related illnesses, and they are completely dependent on imports for basics.
Like penicillin or insulin.
Right.
And the domestic Indian companies couldn't just step in and make generic versions because of how the law worked. The 1911 law gave Western companies a product patent.
Yes, and that distinction is the bedrock of this entire deep dive.
So let's drill down into that. If a Western company held a product patent on a specific chemical compound, say, some novel anti-diabetic drug, that specific molecular structure is locked down.
The final destination is locked.
Okay, so if I'm an Indian chemist in Bombay in 1960, and I figure out a completely brilliant, entirely different way to synthesize that exact same molecule in my lab using cheaper local stuff,
The law says you still can't sell it.
my unique process doesn't matter at all.
It doesn't matter one bit because the final product belongs to the Western company. That is the paralyzing nature of a strict product patent regime in a developing economy.
Wow. Were there any cases of people trying to fight that?
Oh, yeah. A pivotal example was a domestic manufacturer named Unicum Laboratories. They actually managed to develop a manufacturing process for a really sought-after anti-diabetic drug.
Okay.
But the Western giant Host held the product patent under the 1911 Act. Hoches took Unicum to the Bombay High Court, secured an injunction, and totally shut the domestic production down.
So the Indian legal framework was actively strangling its own domestic capacity,
Exactly.
which eventually forces the Indian government to act. You've got this huge population, rampant poverty in medicine that costs a fortune.
Right, so they formed committees, the Bakshi Tech Chand Committee, and eventually the Iyengar Committee to completely overhaul their intellectual property regime.
And the result of all that is the Patents Act of 1970.
The turning point.
Yeah, this is where the tectonic plates shift. The 1970 Act fundamentally changes the rules for chemical and pharmaceutical inventions. They abolish product patents for medicine.
They moved entirely to a process patent regime for pharmaceuticals.
So under the 1970 Act, the government basically declares that the chemical compound itself can no longer be protected by a patent.
Right. The only thing an inventor could protect was the specific novel manufacturing pathway used to create it.
Right, so to use an analogy for you listening, imagine a Western company invents a revolutionary new engine. Under the old rules, nobody else can build that engine.
Right.
But under the 1970 rules, the Indian government says you can patent the specific robotic assembly line you used to build it, but the engine itself, anyone can build it.
As long as they design their own tools and their own assembly line to get there.
Right, so for an Indian chemical lab, this was basically an open invitation to legally reverse engineer everything on the Western market.
And the Indian scientific community answered that invitation with incredible aggression and skill.
I mean, how exactly did they do it?
Well, pharma manufacturing involves synthesizing active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, through complex chemical reactions.
Okay.
Western companies might use a specific, really expensive catalyst or a high-temperature pathway. Indian chemists simply looked at the final molecule and reverse-engineered alternative pathways.
So they found ways to make the same APIs using cheaper, locally available reagents at room temperature.
Exactly. Completely bypassing the patented Western processes.
And because they were competing purely on process efficiency, the cost of manufacturing just plummeted.
And the cost of the medicine for the Indian consumer plummeted right along with it.
But obviously, Western pharmaceutical companies did not just sit back and applaud this ingenuity.
Not at all. From their perspective, this was legalized, state-sponsored theft of billions of dollars in R&D.
So what did they do?
Many multinational pharma companies just packed up and left the Indian market entirely.
Wow.
Yeah, they refused to introduce their newest drugs in a jurisdiction where their product patents wouldn't be recognized.
But I'm guessing that exit just created a massive vacuum.
It did, which domestic Indian companies like Cipla, Ranbaxy, and Dr. Reddy's rapidly filled.
Throughout the 70s and 80s, they built absolute empires on reverse engineering.
Oh, massive empires. They scaled up manufacturing, optimized supply chains, and began exporting these incredibly cheap generics to other developing nations across Africa and Asia.
And that's why India eventually earned the nickname the pharmacy of the world.
That is the sole reason, yes. The 1970 Patents Act.
But, the global economy doesn't remain fragmented forever. The 80s and 90s bring this massive wave of globalization.
Right, the TRIPS escalation.
Yeah. The U.S. and the EU are looking at global trade and realizing that intellectual property is their most valuable export.
They don't just export cars and steel anymore. It's software, entertainment, heavily researched pharmaceuticals.
And they see countries like India and Brazil essentially operating completely outside the Western IP ecosystem.
Which leads to the creation of the World Trade Organization and, critically, the TRIPS Agreement in 1995.
The Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights.
TRIPS was a monumental shift in international law. Before TRIPS, IP was largely just a matter of domestic policy. Treaties existed, but enforcement was incredibly weak.
But TRIPS linked IP directly to international trade.
Brutally and effectively. If a country wanted access to the massive WTO markets to export their textiles or agricultural products, they had to harmonize their domestic IP laws to a baseline standard dictated by TRIPS.
And for India, looking specifically at Article 27 of the TRIPS Agreement, the mandate was crystal clear.
Article 27 required member nations to provide patent protection for both products and processes in all fields of technology.
No more exempting pharmaceuticals, no more relying solely on process patents. TRIPS was designed to kill the 1970 Patents Act.
India had to bring product patents back. They were granted a 10-year transition period because they were a developing nation, but the deadline was set in stone. 2005.
By 2005, India had to legally recognize 20-year monopolies on pharmaceutical products. The era of unrestricted reverse engineering was supposed to end.
Right.
Now, looking at this from a strict contract perspective, I have to push back a little on the narrative that India was a victim here.
Okay, let's hear it.
Well, in India wanted the benefits of joining the WTO. They wanted their IT services and agricultural exports to have access to Western markets, so they signed the TRIPS agreement.
True.
They knew exactly what Article 27 demanded. Weren't they essentially making a binding promise to adopt the Western model of patent protection? Why should they be allowed to backtrack or find loopholes after signing the contract?
And that contract perspective is exactly how the USTR and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce framed the issue today. They argue that a deal is a deal.
Right.
However, to understand international treaty law, you have to look at the geopolitical leverage points and the text of subsequent declarations.
What was happening at the time?
Well, in the late 90s and early 2000s, as the TRIPS deadlines approached, the developing world was facing an existential health crisis, the HIV/AIDS epidemic.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia were dying because the patented antiretroviral cocktails produced by Western companies cost upwards of $10,000 to $15,000 per patient per year.
While Indian generic manufacturers like Cipla were offering to produce the exact same cocktail for roughly $1 a day.
Precisely.
Yeah,
And this created an unignorable moral and political crisis at the WTO.
I can imagine.
Developing nations formed a massive coalition, arguing that strict enforcement of TRIPS product patents would effectively be a death sentence for millions of their citizens.
The tension threatened to tear the WTO apart, right?
It really did. And this all culminated in the WTO Ministerial Conference in Doha in 2001. The result of that was the Doha Declaration on the TRIPS Agreement and Public Health.
And the wording of that declaration is crucial. I was looking at the text provided in our sources. It explicitly states that the TRIPS agreement, quote, does not and should not prevent members from taking measures to protect public health.
It was a massive diplomatic concession by the developed world.
It goes on to affirm that the agreement can and should be interpreted in a way that supports members' right to promote access to medicines for all.
Our sources actually quote the former Indian Commerce and Industry Minister, Mursali Moran. He described the resulting TRIPS text as a masterpiece of ambiguity, couched in the language of diplomatic compromise, resulting in a verbal tightrope walk with a prose remarkably elastic and capable of being stretched all the way to Geneva.
That is quite the quote.
It really is. The Doha Declaration essentially told India, yes, you have to implement product patents by 2005, but you have the sovereign right to define the specific standards of what constitutes a patentable product in a way that protects your public health.
So they gave them the legal wiggle room, and India drove a freight train right through it.
They absolutely did.
Which brings us to the actual mechanism India used to exploit that ambiguity. In 2005, India passes the Patents Amendment Act to finally comply with TRIPS.
On paper, they did it. They allowed product patents for medicines.
But they introduced a completely unique, highly stringent hurdle to prevent Western companies from simply sweeping in and patenting everything. This is the infamous Section 3.
Right. Section 3 is the absolute core of the ongoing friction. To understand its power, we have to contrast it with standard international patent law.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Under the TRIPS baseline, an invention must meet 3 criteria to be patentable. It must be novel, it must involve an inventive step, meaning it's not obvious, and it must be capable of industrial application.
Novel, inventive, and useful.
Yes, but the Indian Parliament, who were heavily lobbied by domestic generic manufacturers and public health advocates, they knew that Western pharma often utilizes a strategy known as Evergreening.
Ah, evergreening. Let's break this down because this is critical.
Please do.
So imagine a tech company releasing the exact same smartphone year after year, but changing the color of the case to keep their exclusive monopoly. In pharma, a company spends over $1 billion developing a completely new drug, a new chemical entity, or NCE.
They get a 20-year patent.
Right. But realistically, the first 10 years are eaten up by clinical trials and regulatory approvals.
So they might only have 7 to 10 years of actual monopoly time on the market.
Exactly, to recoup that massive investment before the generics swoop in. So as that patent cliff approaches, the originator company wants to extend their monopoly.
And they do this by making incremental modifications to the original chemical compound.
Like what?
They might change the inactive ingredients, they might create an extended release tablet instead of a standard pill, or isolate a specific salt derivative.
And in jurisdictions like the US or the EU, these incremental modifications are frequently granted new, separate patents, right?
Yes, extending the company's exclusivity over that specific version for another 20 years.
The U.S. argues this rewards continuous improvement. But India looked at this and said, no, we cannot afford to pay monopoly prices for another 20 years just because you put the same medicine into a slow-release capsule.
So they draft Section 3D, and the specific language is what the USTR absolutely disguises.
What does it say?
It states that the mere discovery of a new form of a known substance, which does not result in the enhancement of the known efficacy of that substance, is not patentable.
So they created a fourth hurdle. Novelty, inventiveness, and industrial application are no longer enough in India.
Exactly. If your invention is a modification of a known drug, you must prove enhanced therapeutic efficacy. You have to clinically demonstrate that the new version treats the disease significantly better than the old version.
And the most spectacular collision over this exact legal definition happened in the Indian Supreme Court in 2013.
The Novartis v. Union of India case.
Yes, this case is a masterclass in how pharmacology meets the law.
It is the defining precedent for Section 3Ds. So, Novartis, the Swiss pharma giant, had developed a revolutionary leukemia drug called Gleevec.
And the active ingredient was a molecule called imatinib.
Right. Now, the underlying molecule, imatinib, was invented in the early 90s, before India allowed product patents. So the base molecule couldn't be patented in India.
But Novartis wasn't trying to patent the base molecule.
No, they filed a patent application for a specific modified version, the beta-crystalline form of imatinib mesylate.
Okay, let's get into the chemistry of this because it matters. What is a beta-crystalline form?
So when you synthesize a drug, the molecules can arrange themselves into different crystal structures known as polymorphs.
Think of carbon, right. The exact same carbon atoms can arrange themselves into soft graphite for a pencil or into a diamond. It's the same base element, but a different physical form.
Great analogy. Novartis argued that this specific beta-crystalline form of their drug was a significant invention. They had data showing it was much more thermodynamically stable, less prone to absorbing moisture.
And crucially, it had a 20 to 30% higher bioavailability than the free base form of the drug.
Bioavailability, meaning the amount of the drug that actually enters the patient's bloodstream and has an active effect.
Right. Novartis argued that a 30% higher bioavailability absolutely represented an inventive step.
And from a strictly scientific perspective, they aren't wrong. Improving bioavailability is a massive achievement.
Because if the drug absorbs better, the patient gets a more consistent dose.
Exactly. So Novartis takes this to the Indian Patent Office, expecting an approval.
But the Patent Office rejects it under Section 3A. And Novartis fights this for years, all the way to the Supreme Court of India.
And the Supreme Court's ruling sent shockwaves through the global pharmaceutical industry. The court heavily scrutinized the phrase, enhanced therapeutic efficacy.
What did they decide?
They ruled that physical improvements like better heat stability, lower moisture absorption, or even that 30% increase in bioavailability do not inherently equal enhanced therapeutic efficacy. The court declared that efficacy strictly means healing power. Unless Novartis could prove that this new beta-crystalline form cured leukemia at a significantly higher rate than the original form, it failed the Section 3 test.
They set the bar astronomically high. You can't just prove it absorbs better, you have to prove it heals better.
And because Novartis couldn't provide clinical data showing a massive jump in the actual cure rate, the Supreme Court denied the patent.
The financial reality of that single gavel drop is staggering. We pulled the numbers from the ICRIER report. Because Novartis had the global monopoly, the cost of a 1-month supply of Gleevec was roughly 1.2 lakh rupees.
Which was over $2,500 at the time, in a country where the per capita income was a fraction of that. The drug was effectively non-existent for the vast majority of the Indian population.
But the moment the Supreme Court denied that patent, the floodgates opened for the Indian generic manufacturers.
Companies like Cipla and Natco ramped up production of the generic imatinib mesylate.
And the price plummeted from 1.2 lakh rupees a month to just 8,000 rupees a month. That's a drop of over 90%.
It was an indisputable public health triumph for the Indian government. Hundreds of thousands of patients gained access to a life-saving oncology drug.
Right. If you are an Indian public health official managing a leukemia ward, Section 3D is heroic.
Without a doubt.
But, I want to genuinely defend the other side of this equation for a second, because the 2026 USTR report isn't just complaining about lost profits. They are making a fundamental argument about the nature of innovation.
Okay. Let's look at their side.
Let's say I'm an R&D director at Pfizer or Novartis. The era of discovering entirely new, blockbuster, new chemical entities, true ground-up discoveries is slowing down drastically.
The pipeline of novel NCEs is undeniably shrinking globally.
Right. It costs literal billions of dollars and takes a decade to bring a completely new drug to market, and 90% of them fail in clinical trials.
So, to keep research labs funded, they rely on incremental innovation.
Exactly. Let's take the heat stability example. If my team spends $50 million researching a new salt derivative of an existing malaria drug, and this new derivative is completely heat stable, so it doesn't need to be refrigerated when shipped to rural clinics in tropical climates.
That is a massive real-world innovation.
It saves lives by surviving the supply chain. But under the strict Indian Supreme Court definition of Section 3, because the chemical doesn't technically cure the malaria better once it's in the bloodstream, it doesn't have enhanced therapeutic efficacy.
You were denied a patent.
My $50 million investment is immediately copied by a generic firm in Hyderabad. If I know India is going to do that, why would I ever spend the money to invent the heat-stable version in the first place?
You've perfectly articulated the core argument of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They view Section 3 not as a shield against evergreening, but as a blunt instrument that penalizes vital incremental research.
Because pharmacology is rarely about overnight revolutions, right?
Right. It is almost entirely driven by decades of slow, iterative improvements. By demanding a massive leap in therapeutic efficacy for every patent, India is fundamentally discouraging the research required to make drugs safer, easier to administer, and more stable.
So you have this intractable collision. India says, we refuse to grant 20-year monopolies for trivial tweaks that price our population out of survival.
And U.S. Pharma says, if you don't legally protect and financially reward our incremental research, we will eventually run out of money to invent anything at all, and everyone loses.
It is a profound philosophical difference in how you value intellectual property.
It is. And it's fascinating to note, as the ICRIER legal analysis points out, that India's underlying logic isn't entirely alien to Western law.
Wait, really?
Yeah, even in the United States, the Patent Office has a requirement for non-obviousness. An invention can't just be new. It has to be non-obvious to a person having ordinary skill in the art.
Oh, interesting.
The ICRIER report cites U.S. court cases where patents on simple salt derivatives of existing drugs were actually invalidated because the patent holder failed to demonstrate unexpected superior results.
So the U.S. legal system effectively does the same thing. They strike down trivial patents.
They do, but the mechanism is what differs. And that difference is everything.
How so?
The U.S. system is generally permissive at the front door. The USPTO grants the patent, and it is largely left to the incredibly expensive, protracted U.S. civil court system to sort out the validity later through patent infringement litigation.
So generic companies in the U.S. have to sue the originators to get the weak patent struck down.
Exactly. India, however, looked at that system and realized they didn't have the luxury of time.
Right, because while the lawsuit drags on for 5 years in the courts, the drug remains under monopoly pricing and Indian patients die.
Precisely. So India designed Section 3 to act as an unyielding filter at the front door. The patent examiner demands the clinical proof of efficacy before the patent is ever granted.
It shifts the burden of proof entirely onto the multinational pharmaceutical company at the moment of application.
Right. And yet, despite the USTR's claims that Section 3D destroys IP rights, the data in the sources shows that between 2010 and 2013, over 77% of all pharmaceutical patents granted in India were awarded to foreign firms.
So front door isn't locked, it's just a very heavy door.
It requires robust clinical evidence, not just theoretical chemical novelty.
Okay, so Section 3D prevents incremental patents from being granted. But that begs a massive question.
What's that?
What happens when an international company creates a genuinely groundbreaking drug? A true new chemical entity. They pass the Section 3 test with flying colors.
Okay, the Indian Patent Office grants them a rock-solid 20-year product patent.
Right, but then the multinational company prices the drug at $10,000 a month. India's front door shield is completely useless then. The patent is active, and the public still can't afford the medicine.
That is the big question. What mechanism protects the patient in that scenario? This is where we transition from the law of patent granting to the intensely controversial realm of patent bypassing. We have to look at the ultimate lever of state power in intellectual property, the compulsory license.
Now, when you read the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Index, the phrase compulsory licensing is treated like a financial doomsday device.
It really is.
But looking at the historical legal context from our sources, this isn't some rogue concept India invented to steal American IP.
Not at all. Compulsory licensing is a globally recognized legal mechanism that has existed for well over a century.
Since when?
Its roots trace back to the Paris Convention for the Protection of Industrial Property in 1883, and it is explicitly affirmed and codified in the WTO's TRIPS agreement under Article 31.
So let's clearly define what it actually does.
Sure.
A compulsory license is a legally mandated action where a sovereign government forces a patent holder to grant usage rights to a third party.
The government steps in and says, your patent is still valid, but we are suspending your exclusive monopoly. We are legally authorizing a generic company to manufacture and sell your invention without your consent.
Crucially, it is not outright expropriation or theft.
Right. Under Article 31 of TRIPS, the generic manufacturer who receives the compulsory license is legally required to pay a reasonable royalty back to the original patent holder.
It is a forced commercial marriage.
Exactly.
But the TRIPS agreement didn't just give governments a blank check to hand out compulsory licenses whenever they want cheaper drugs, did it? There have to be strict parameters.
Yes. TRIPS Article 31 dictates that a compulsory license should generally only be granted after the generic company has attempted to negotiate a voluntary license with the patent holder on reasonable commercial terms and failed.
Okay.
Furthermore, it is designed to be a safety valve for specific scenarios. If the patent holder is abusing their exclusive rights by engaging in anti-competitive practices, or, most notably, in situations of extreme urgency or national emergencies.
To break the glass in case of a fire.
Yes.
And in India, that glass was shattered in a highly public, globally scrutinized way in 2012.
The landmark case involving the German pharma behemoth Bayer and their kidney and liver cancer drug, Nexivar.
Right, the chemical name is sorafenib tosylate.
This case is the absolute focal point of international anxiety regarding Indian IP enforcement. Bayer held a valid Indian patent for Nexivar. They had cleared all the hurdles.
But they were importing the drug and pricing it at roughly 2.8 lakh rupees for a one-month supply, over $5,000 a month.
In 2012, the average annual per capita income in India was barely over $1,000.
So an entire year's salary wouldn't buy a week of this life-saving cancer treatment.
Exactly.
But if I'm putting myself in Bayer's shoes for a moment from a pure business logic standpoint, if you price a product at $5,000 in a market where almost no one can afford it, you aren't actually making any money.
You sell near zero volume.
Right. Why wouldn't Bayer voluntarily drop the price in India to capture the volume of a billion-person market?
Because the pharmaceutical industry operates on a system of global reference pricing.
What does that mean?
If Bayer drastically slashes the official list price of Nexivar in India to $100 a month, the health ministries in Germany, the UK, and France will immediately look at that data and demand the exact same price concession for their own national health systems.
Oh, wow. So they protect the high-margin markets at all costs.
Multinational companies will often accept near zero sales in a developing market, rather than risk cannibalizing their high-margin pricing structures in the developed world.
That is a brutal economic calculus.
It is. So Bayer holds the line on the 2.8 lakh price. An Indian generic manufacturer named Natco Pharma sees this.
And following the TRIPS protocol, Natco formally approaches Bayer and requests a voluntary license, offering a royalty.
But Bayer refuses. So Natco goes directly to the Controller General of Patents in India and files for a compulsory license.
And this triggers a massive legal battle in front of the Intellectual Property Appellate Board, the IPA.
The Indian government had to justify granting the first ever compulsory license in the country's history.
What was their justification?
They relied on specific language in the Indian Patents Act, which states that a compulsory license can be issued if the patent is not being worked in the territory of India, or if the reasonable requirements of the public haven't been satisfied at a reasonably affordable price.
That language is incredibly subjective. What constitutes a reasonably affordable price?
Bayer argued exactly that. They argued that affordable is a subjective term and shouldn't be grounds for stripping a patent. They also said they were offering patient assistance programs.
But the IPB heavily scrutinized Bayer's actual supply numbers.
The board found that Bayer was importing such a minuscule quantity of Nexivar that it reached less than 2% of the eligible patient population in India.
Less than 2%. So 98% of patients were left completely unserved.
The IPA ruled that importing a tiny amount of the drug at a price point entirely divorced from the local economic reality constituted a failure to work the patent.
Yeah. So they granted the compulsory license to Natco Pharma,
They did.
and the immediate economic impact mirrors the Novartis case perfectly. Once Natco began domestic production, the price of the generic sorafenib tosylate plummeted from 2.8 lakh rupees a month to roughly 8,800 rupees a month.
Matco was ordered to pay a 6% royalty on net sales back to Bayer.
Did Bayer just accept that?
No, Bayer appealed the decision all the way up to the Bombay High Court and eventually the Supreme Court, but the Indian judiciary upheld the compulsory license at every level.
But if we connect this isolated case to the broader geopolitical picture, we have to ask why this specific ruling terrifies the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and international investors so deeply.
Because it's not just about one liver cancer drug. It is about a massive paradigm shift in how a government defines a national emergency.
Right. Historically, looking at the Doha Declaration era, compulsory licenses were almost exclusively deployed during rapidly spreading communicable pandemics.
The HIV/AIDS crisis in Africa, the outbreak of H1N1 bird flu, or extreme localized malaria epidemics.
In those scenarios, Western pharma grudgingly accepted that their patents might be temporarily overridden. They built the risk into their models.
It was viewed as an extreme exception for infectious crises. But what India did with Nexavar, and what the health ministry considered doing with other expensive oncology drugs,
Like Herceptin or Sprycel.
right, was apply the compulsory license framework to non-communicable diseases, NCDs.
Diseases like cancer, diabetes, and heart disease.
Exactly. The ICRIER report highlights a staggering demographic reality. As India develops, non-communicable diseases are rapidly overtaking infectious diseases as the primary cause of mortality.
Cancer alone accounts for roughly 650,000 deaths annually in India.
The Indian government is beginning to view the epidemic of NCDs as a slow-moving, structural national emergency that entirely justifies state intervention in IP.
And that is the terrifying part for a Western pharma executive.
Why is that?
Because treating chronic non-communicable diseases, selling daily pills for diabetes, or multi-year regimens for oncology, that is the highly lucrative, stable foundation of their entire global business model.
Absolutely.
If cancer and heart disease are suddenly declared emergencies in massive emerging markets like India or Brazil, allowing governments to routinely strip patents, the projected revenue models for international R&D collapse entirely.
It creates immense structural uncertainty for pharmaceutical investors.
And the U.S. Chamber of Commerce vehemently argues that compulsory licensing was intended only for acute infectious emergencies, right?
Right, not for standard commercial situations involving chronic healthcare management. They argue that if India normalizes this, it fundamentally destroys the incentive for Western companies to launch their newest drugs in the Indian market.
So we have explored the two massive legal weapons India actively uses, Section 3 to block patents at the door, and compulsory licensing to bypass them if they get through.
But a huge portion of the USTR Special 301 report and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Index focuses on what India refuses to do.
Right, regulatory structures that India has explicitly chosen not to implement. This brings us to two deeply technical, highly contentious legal concepts: data exclusivity and patent linkage.
These are considered TRIPS Plus standards.
Meaning they aren't in the baseline TRIPS agreement.
Exactly. The U.S. and the EU mandate them domestically and want them implemented globally, but TRIPS doesn't explicitly require them. The U.S. uses bilateral trade pressure to try and force nations to adopt these TRIPS Plus measures.
Let's tackle data exclusivity first, because it strikes at the heart of how drugs are actually approved for human consumption.
Okay.
Let me set up the hypothetical from the perspective of an American innovator company. Let's say I invent a completely novel drug. The patent office gives me my 20-year monopoly.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But before I can legally sell a single pill, I have to prove to the health regulator like the FDA in the US or the DCGI in India that the drug is safe and effective in humans.
Which means running massive, multi-phased clinical trials.
Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3. I test the drug on thousands of human volunteers over 5 to 7 years. It costs me upwards of $500 million just to generate the safety and efficacy data.
That's a huge investment.
So my argument is, I generated that data. I paid for it. It is my proprietary trade secret. Shouldn't that data belong exclusively to me?
And that is the exact philosophical foundation of data exclusivity. In the United States, this framework was codified in the historic Hatch-Waxman Act of 1984.
Which was a massive compromise between originators and generics, right?
Yes. In the U.S., and similarly in the EU, The originator company is granted a specific statutory period of data exclusivity, usually 5 to 10 years from the date of the drug's approval.
And during that window.
During that 5 to 10-year window, the health regulator is legally forbidden from relying on the originator's clinical trial data to approve a competitor's generic version.
So even if the patent somehow gets invalidated early, the generic company is still blocked by the data exclusivity period. The FDA simply won't process their application.
Exactly. If a generic company wanted to launch during the data exclusivity period, they would theoretically have to recruit their own thousands of patients and run their own $500 million phase 3 clinical trials.
Which generic companies obviously never do because their entire business model relies on low overhead.
Right. So data exclusivity essentially grants a secondary, guaranteed monopoly period that operates entirely independent of the patent office.
But looking at the trade reports, India refuses to offer this.
India has no statutory data exclusivity period whatsoever. In India, the drug regulatory system is designed for maximum speed.
How does it work there?
When an Indian generic manufacturer wants to produce a copy of an approved Western drug, the Indian regulator does not require the generic company to repeat the massive clinical trials. They allow the generic manufacturer to simply rely on the published safety data generated by the original Western innovator.
The regulator essentially says, Pfizer already proved this chemical compound doesn't cause liver failure in a 10,000-person trial. We accept that science as established fact. So what does the Indian generic company actually have to prove to get approved?
They only have to prove bioequivalence.
Wait, so they just do a blood test?
Essentially, yes. Bioequivalence testing is vastly simpler and cheaper than a full clinical trial. The generic company takes a small group of healthy volunteers, gives them the original Western drug, and measures the pharmacokinetics.
How the drug is absorbed into the blood plasma over time?
Right, charting the area under the curve. Then, they give the volunteers their new generic version and measure it again.
And if the curves match?
If the blood plasma absorption curves match within a strict statistical margin, the generic is deemed bioequivalent. It acts the same way in the body. And because they are allowed to rely on the originator's foundational safety data, the generic gets immediate regulatory approval.
The U.S. Chamber of Commerce views this as state-sanctioned free riding. They argue that Indian generics are leeching off the hundreds of millions of dollars invested by Western companies.
But when you read the ICRIER analysis of India's justification, the Indian stance is rooted in medical ethics and resource management.
How do they justify it ethically?
The Indian government argues that requiring a generic company to repeat full-scale clinical trials on a drug that the entire global scientific community already knows is safe is a grotesque, unethical waste of resources.
Because it would involve subjecting human volunteers to experimental testing unnecessarily.
Exactly. It would drastically delay the introduction of affordable generic medicines to the market by 5 to 10 years, and it would artificially inflate the cost of the generic drug, completely defeating the purpose of a generic industry.
India essentially points to the TRIPS agreement and says, TRIPS Article 39 requires us to protect undisclosed test data against unfair commercial use. We do that with our existing trade secrecy laws.
But TRIPS does not legally mandate a 5-year exclusivity blackout period, so we aren't going to invent one.
This allows Indian generics to hit the market with incredible speed the moment a patent expires or the moment it is struck down by Section 3.
Which flows directly into the second missing piece the U.S. is demanding: patent linkage.
So looking at the USTR demands, I kept seeing this phrase, patent linkage. If I'm understanding this correctly, this concept attempts to turn a nation's health and safety regulator into an intellectual property enforcer.
That's a good way to put it.
In a linkage system, the safety guys at the FDA equivalent aren't legally allowed to approve a generic drug if the patent office says the original drug is still protected. There is a legal firewall linking the two agencies.
But India explicitly outlawed that crosstalk.
They did. India actively rejected the concept of patent linkage, codified in a fascinating Delhi High Court ruling in 2009. Once again, it involved Bayer.
Bayer really seems to have been the tip of the spear in challenging the Indian IP framework.
They were relentlessly aggressive in testing the boundaries of the law. Bayer filed a writ petition in the Delhi High Court trying to legally force the Drug Controller General of India, the DCGI, India's FDA, to deny marketing approval to Cipla for a generic version of a patented drug.
Bayer argued that by granting safety approval to a generic model while the patent was still active, the DCGI was essentially facilitating patent infringement.
They wanted the health regulator to do the police work for the patent office.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But the Delhi High Court delivered a definitive ruling. They stated that the mandate of the DCGI is strictly limited to evaluating the scientific safety, efficacy, and quality of medicines.
The health regulator is not legally competent to judge complex, nuanced questions of patent validity or infringement.
The court mandated that the two spheres, regulatory safety and intellectual property rights, must remain completely legally siloed.
So in India, the safety regulator puts on legal blinders. They just look at the bioequivalence data.
Mhm.
Does the Cipla generic act identically to the Bayer drug in the human bloodstream? Is it manufactured safely? Yes, approved.
They completely ignore the patent status. In the eyes of the Indian legal system, a patent is a private right.
So if Bayer holds a valid patent and Cipla starts making a generic, the government won't step in.
Nope. The Indian government is not going to proactively step in and shut Cipla down. The burden of enforcement rests entirely on the private patent holder. Bayer has to hire lawyers, file a civil lawsuit, and seek a judicial injunction.
But the strategic reality of that is devastating for the originator, because the Indian court system is notoriously backlogged.
Right. While Bayer spends 3 years fighting Cipla in civil court to prove infringement, Cipla already has regulatory approval.
The generic is already flooding the market, the price has crashed, and Bayer's monopoly is effectively broken, even if they eventually win the lawsuit years later.
That is the precise friction point. The lack of patent linkage and the lack of data exclusivity create an environment where generic companies can move with astonishing speed and regulatory cover.
Severely eroding the value of an Indian patent, even if one is successfully granted. This is why the U.S. Chamber of Commerce International IP Index ranks India so abysmally low year after year.
But, and this is where it gets really interesting, when we dive deep into the ICRIER report, there's a massive paradigm shift happening internally.
A domestic twist that completely upends the traditional U.S. versus India narrative.
Because the Indian pharmaceutical industry of 2026 is not the same industry it was in 1970 or even 2005.
The evolution is stark. Historically, as we discussed, the entire Indian pharma empire was built on a free rider system, reverse engineering small molecule chemicals.
Relying heavily on the lack of data exclusivity and patent linkage to get cheap generics to market instantly.
But massive Indian conglomerates, companies like Biocon, Glenmark, Dr. Reddy's, and Sun Pharma have matured. They possess immense capital and vast global footprints.
And they are realizing that the future of medicine isn't just in reverse engineering old chemical pills, it's in highly complex biologics and discovering their own new chemical entities.
Let's expand on biologics, because that science changes the regulatory calculus entirely.
It does. A traditional small molecule drug like aspirin or Nexavar is synthesized from chemicals. It has a relatively simple, easily copied structure.
But a biologic like a monoclonal antibody used for advanced immunology or targeted cancer therapies is vastly more complex. It is literally grown in living cells.
You cannot simply reverse engineer a biologic using standard chemistry. The generic equivalent of a biologic is called a biosimilar.
And proving that a biosimilar is safe and effective is exponentially harder than proving simple bioequivalence for a chemical pill.
You can't just run a tiny pharmacokinetic test. You essentially have to run massive, highly expensive clinical trials just to prove your biosimilar works like the original biologic.
So as these massive Indian companies transition into developing entirely novel drugs and incredibly complex biologics, they are suddenly the ones spending hundreds of millions of dollars globally on clinical trials.
They are generating massive troves of proprietary safety data.
And the geopolitical irony is profound. Because they are now the innovators generating the data, these Indian pharmaceutical giants are suddenly lobbying the Indian government to enact data exclusivity laws.
The very companies that built their multi-billion-dollar empires by exploiting the lack of data exclusivity are now demanding the Indian government build a regulatory wall to protect their new R&D investments.
The free rider system that built their wealth has matured into a liability for their own domestic ambition.
It is a classic historical cycle of an industry outgrowing the permissive regulations that birthed it. The ICRIER analysis suggests that this internal domestic pressure might eventually be the catalyst that forces a change in India's IP stance.
Far more effectively than decades of external American complaints.
Absolutely.
Which brings us perfectly to the economic reality of the present moment. We've traced the legal history, Section 3, compulsory licenses, and the data exclusivity debates.
Let's look at how this all collides in the geopolitical landscape of 2026.
Looking at the latest USTR Special 301 report and the accompanying tariff updates, The tension is reaching a breaking point.
The rhetoric in the 2026 USTR report is as aggressive as it has ever been. India firmly remains on the priority watch list.
And the United States continues to utilize intense diplomatic leverage, regional trade negotiations, and the threat of broad economic sanctions to push for those TRIPS Plus standards.
They want Section 3D repealed or drastically diluted. They want patent linkage enforced.
The U.S. is using every tool in the arsenal to force India to adopt the American model of IP protection. But then we look at the actual trade policy mechanisms the U.S. implements.
Specifically, the 2026 U.S. Pharma tariff policy.
Yes, and we see a contradiction so glaring it is almost hard to believe.
It is perhaps the most defining paradox of this entire global supply chain.
So in an effort to force pharmaceutical manufacturing back onto American soil, the U.S. government implemented a massive, punitive 100% tariff levy on imported patented drugs.
If a Western company manufactures their patented blockbuster drug overseas and tries to bring it into the U.S., they get hit with a 100% tax. The goal is supply chain localization.
A 100% tariff is an economic sledgehammer.
It really is.
Yeah.
But buried in the architecture of that tariff policy is a critical, highly specific exemption.
What's the exemption?
The United States explicitly exempted all generic drugs from the 100% tariff.
I really want to emphasize the sheer irony of this. The United States is punishing the importation of patented drugs, but explicitly protecting the uninterrupted flow of generic drugs.
Why? Because as we established at the very beginning of this deep dive, the American healthcare system is hopelessly addicted to Indian generics.
The Global Trade Research Initiative, the GTRI report, shows that India exported $9.7 billion worth of medicines to the U.S. in 2025 alone.
If the U.S. government were to slap a 100% tariff on those Indian generics,
or if they actually succeeded in forcing India to dismantle its generic manufacturing pipeline by imposing strict Western IP laws,
the cost of basic healthcare in the United States would explode overnight.
The contradiction is foundational. The United States relentlessly criticizes the Indian intellectual property framework. They accuse India of weak laws, put them on watch lists, and demand protection of American patents.
Yet, simultaneously, the U.S. government must actively write specific trade exemptions to protect the massive influx of cheap generic drugs that are only possible because of that very same weak Indian IP framework.
The U.S. relies heavily on the output of the exact system it is trying to diplomatically dismantle in order to keep its own healthcare costs from completely bankrupting the American public.
It is the geopolitical equivalent of aggressively complaining about the chaotic, rule-breaking kitchen staff, while absolutely relying on the cheap, delicious meal they produce every single day.
Exactly. And the GTRI report actually highlights this risk to India. They warn the Indian government against caving to U.S. demands,
arguing that diluting Section 3 or rolling back compulsory licensing wouldn't just hurt the Indian generic industry.
It would cause a massive spike in medicine prices globally, severely harming patients in the developing world, and ironically, severely harming the American taxpayer.
It highlights how deeply interconnected and fragile the global pharmaceutical ecosystem truly is.
So, as we bring this deep dive to a close, let's look at the vast landscape we've mapped out today. We started with the colonial legacy of the 1911 Act and how the 1970 Patents Act utilized process patents to birth the pharmacy of the world.
We saw how the TRIPS agreement tried to force standardization and how India utilized the Doha Declaration to carve out legal sovereignty.
We examined the mechanics of Section 3, acting as an unyielding front door filter, demanding absolute proof of enhanced therapeutic efficacy to prevent evergreening,
a standard that famously brought down Novartis's Glivec patent. We explored compulsory licensing, the ultimate safety valve, and how the Bayer-Nexavar case signaled a shift toward treating NCDs as national emergencies.
We looked at the missing pieces, the deliberate lack of data exclusivity and patent linkage, which allow Indian generics to bypass wasteful clinical trials and move with blistering speed,
forcing Western pharma to rely on slow civil litigation.
And finally, we looked at the inescapable paradox of 2026, a United States that demands IP compliance while actively sheltering the generic imports that non-compliance creates.
For decades, India has successfully defended an intellectual property regime perfectly tailored for a developing nation. It prioritizes the immediate survival and affordable access of its massive population over the macroeconomic defense of foreign R&D investments.
And this is the final thought I want you to carry with you as you digest all of this. We discussed how the major Indian domestic companies are evolving. They're shifting away from the simple chemical reverse engineering of the past, and they are pouring billions into complex biologics and novel molecules.
They are beginning to desire the exact same data protections and IP shields they spent decades fighting against.
It raises a profound question about the future of global health. The United States, the EU, and the WTO have tried for nearly 30 years to force India to change its IP laws through external pressure, trade sanctions, and diplomatic coercion with very limited success.
But will the force that finally dismantles India's controversial IP regime be external Western pressure? Or will it be the evolving capitalist ambition of its own maturing domestic pharmaceutical industry?
When the pharmacy of the world decides it wants to be the laboratory of the world, the rules are destined to change from the inside out.
That is the ultimate tension. When you step back and look at the global patent system, we all desperately want it to be clean. We want the rules to be binary, fair, and universally applicable, like a precise medical diagnosis.
But as we've seen today, when you introduce the realities of human survival, the desperation of national sovereignty, and billions of dollars in global trade, the picture is incredibly complex.
It is a constantly shifting landscape of compromise, friction, and survival.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the muddy waters of international pharmaceutical patents. Keep questioning the balance between innovation and accessibility. Keep looking at the forces behind the headlines.